Listen up. There's a man out there who society thinks is broken. He's the guy who turns down party invites, not because he's shy, but because he's got something better to do. He's the one who doesn't post every meal on Instagram, doesn't need constant attention, and doesn't lose his mind when his phone dies. And you know what? Society calls him weird. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. This man isn't just living, he's thriving in ways that would make the average attention-seeking, validation-hungry person lose their absolute why? Because while everyone else is drowning in the noise, he's found something most people spend their entire lives searching for: true power. Let me paint you a picture of what we've all been told is normal. Wake up and immediately check what everyone else is doing, thinking, feeling. Fill every quiet moment with other people's voices, podcasts during commutes, background chatter at work, constant texting and calling. Never sit in silence because that feels weird or uncomfortable. Always need plans, always need company, always need someone else around to feel okay about ourselves. Sound familiar? Here's where it gets interesting and where most of us start feeling uncomfortable. What happens when someone removes all that noise? What happens when they strip away the constant need for external validation, the endless chatter, the desperate search for belonging in crowds that demand conformity? They discover something terrifying. They discover who they actually are. And for most of us, that's scarier than any horror movie we'll ever watch. We've been so busy being who we think we should be that we've forgotten who we actually are underneath all the performance. But not this guy. The man who loves being alone made a different choice, a choice that society desperately wants us to believe is wrong. He looked at the world and said, "This is bullshit." Not in an angry way, not in a depressed way, but in a clear, decisive way that cut through all the noise and landed on one simple truth. We've been living someone else's script, following rules, written by marketers, influenced by people who don't care about us, chasing dreams that aren't even ours. We're like actors who forgot we were acting, completely lost in a role that's slowly suffocating our true nature. But what happens when someone refuses to play that game? Why do you think society pushes so hard for constant connection? Why do you think every movie, every song, every advertisement tells us that being alone equals being broken? Why do you think loner is treated like a dirty word? Because they know something we're just starting to figure out. The man who's comfortable in his own skin can't be controlled. He can't be manipulated. He can't be sold in security wrapped in pretty packages. He doesn't need their products, their validation, or their permission to be happy. He's achieved something most people spend their entire lives chasing: inner peace. And he didn't get it from a guru, a self-help book, or a wellness retreat. He got it from the most radical act possible in our hyper-connected world. He sat alone with himself and refused to run. Here's what Arthur Schopenhauer figured out long before Instagram existed. A man can be himself only so long as he is alone. Think about that for a second. When was the last time any of us were truly alone? Not just physically alone while multitasking through life, but actually alone with our thoughts. No distractions, no mental pacifiers, just us and the raw, unfiltered reality of our own minds. Scared yet? Most of us are. That's why we fill every moment with noise. We're terrified of what we might discover in the silence. But the man who loves being alone, he's not afraid of that silence. He owns it. While everyone else is fighting for attention in a crowded room, screaming to be heard over the chaos, he's sitting in his quiet corner, building something extraordinary. He's not trying to fit in because he's too busy standing out. Not through desperate attention seeking, but through the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly who he is. Here's where things get really uncomfortable for the system we're all trapped in. This man doesn't need external approval. He doesn't need applause. He doesn't need others to understand him, validate him, or even acknowledge he exists. And that makes him dangerous. Not dangerous in a harmful way. Dangerous in the way that threatens everything society has taught us to believe about happiness and success. The system has convinced us that happiness comes from external sources, other people, possessions, achievements that others can see and applaud. It's created an entire economy based on our insecurity, our need to belong, our fear of being alone. But what happens when someone breaks free from that system? What happens when someone discovers that true contentment doesn't come from the crowd? It comes from within. They become untouchable, want to know why the system fears him. Because he's not a good consumer. He doesn't buy things to fill emotional voids. He doesn't need retail therapy, status symbols, or experiences designed to impress others. He's not scrolling endlessly through content designed to keep him distracted and dissatisfied. He's not addicted to the dopamine hits that keep most people's attention fractured and their wallets empty. He's economically dangerous because he's psychologically free. While most of us are renting our peace from other people, borrowing our self-worth from approval and recognition, leasing our happiness from relationships that might disappear tomorrow, this man owns his peace. Marcus Aurelius figured this out nearly 2,000 years ago. Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. Think about the people we all know who seem to always be in some kind of drama. Their mood depends on who calls them back, who includes them in plans, who validates their decisions. They're like emotional ping pong balls bouncing between highs and lows based on how other people treat them. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine someone whose mood, whose sense of self-worth, whose entire emotional state is completely independent of external circumstances. Someone who's genuinely happy whether they're at a party or sitting alone in their room. That's terrifying to the system because it reveals something we've all been taught to avoid, that we've been living as emotional slaves, completely dependent on others for our basic psychological needs. What he's really doing in all that solitude. Here's what society gets wrong about the man who loves being alone. They think he's doing nothing. They're dead wrong. While others are busy consuming drama, consuming other people's opinions, he's creating. He's reading books that expand his mind instead of mindlessly consuming drama that shrinks it. He's developing skills instead of developing addictions to instant gratification. He's having deep conversations with himself instead of shallow conversations with people who don't really know him. But here's the part that'll really mess with your head. He's not doing any of this to prove a point. He's not trying to be different or special or superior. He's doing it because it feels right to him. Because when someone strips away all the noise, all the expectations, this is what emerges. This is who he actually is. CG. Jung had a revolutionary insight that most of us spend our entire lives running from parts of ourselves we don't want to face. He developed the concept of the shadow, representing the hidden, repressed, or denied aspects of our personality that we try to keep buried. But here's Jung's profound discovery. Those who actually confront and integrate these hidden parts of themselves, who sit alone with all their contradictions, fears, and imperfections, become psychologically whole. Jung called this process individuation, becoming who you truly are rather than who you think you should be. While most of us are projecting our fears onto others, blaming the world for our problems, or drowning our insecurities in noise and distraction, the man who loves being alone is doing something much braver. He's looking in the mirror. Not the Instagram filter mirror that shows us what we want to see, but the real mirror that shows everything. The good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between. And instead of running from what he sees, he makes friends with it. This is what makes him dangerous in the best possible way. While others are fragmented, part of them hidden, part of them fake, part of them desperate for approval, he's integrated, he's whole, he's real. And that kind of authenticity is magnetic. The why factor, finding your purpose. Friedrich Nietzsche dropped this bomb. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Most of us are living backwards. We're so focused on the how to get more recognition, how to fit in, how to avoid being alone, that we never discover our why. But solitude forces someone to confront the big questions. When they strip away all the distractions, all the external noise, they're left with the most important question of all. What actually matters to them? Not what their parents think should matter. Not what society says should matter. Not what gets the most approval or recognition. What actually, genuinely, deeply matters to them. The man who loves being alone has answered that question. And once someone knows their why, once they've discovered what truly drives them from the inside out, everything else becomes background noise. That's when they become dangerous, because they're no longer controlled by the crowd. They're free. Here's what's happening. While everyone else is performing their lives on social media, this guy is building something real. But what is he building? He's building mental strength. While others are weakening their attention span with constant stimulation, he's strengthening his ability to focus deeply on what matters. He's building emotional resilience. While others are becoming more fragile, more dependent on external validation, he's becoming more stable, more self-sufficient. He's building authentic relationships, not hundreds of shallow connections, but a few deep ones with people who actually know and appreciate who he really is. He's building skills, real skills, skills that come from deep practice. But here's the part that'll really blow your mind. He's building all of this without needing to tell anyone about it. He's not posting progress updates, not seeking applause, not fishing for compliments. He's just building. And when the world finally sees what he's created in his work, in his character, in the quiet confidence he carries, they're shocked. Where did this come from? How did he get so good at this? When did he become so solid? The answer's simple. While others were performing, he was practicing. Most of us are slaves and don't even know it. We think we're free because we can choose between different ways to stay busy, different forms of entertainment to consume, different ways to distract ourselves from the growing emptiness inside. But the man who loves being alone, he's figured out that true freedom doesn't come from having more choices. It comes from needing fewer of them. He doesn't need to be entertained every moment because he's learned to find joy in simple things. He doesn't need constant validation because he's learned to validate himself. He doesn't need to escape from his thoughts because he's made peace with them. That's real freedom. And it scares the hell out of a society that profits from our enslavement. Now, I know what some of us are thinking, but what about connection? What about love? What about community? Fair questions, but here's what we might be missing. The man who loves being alone isn't against connection. He's against fake connection. He's not unsocial. He's anti-bullshit. He'd rather have one real conversation than 100 shallow ones. He'd rather have one person who truly knows him than 1,000 acquaintances who only know his public image. Quality over quantity isn't just a saying to him, it's a way of life. And here's the really uncomfortable truth. His relationships are probably deeper and more meaningful than most because he brings his whole self to them. Not the fragmented, approval-seeking, performance version of himself that many of us bring to relationships. He brings the real deal. Here's the paradox that'll blow your mind. The man who needs relationships the least often has the best ones. Why? Because he's not bringing neediness to the table. He's not trying to extract validation, security, or identity from other people. He's not performing to keep others interested. He's bringing his whole, complete self to relationships. Not because he needs to, but because he chooses to. And choice is infinitely more powerful than need. When someone spends time with him, they know it's genuine. When he cares about someone, they know it's real. When he commits to something, they know it's solid. He's dangerous to the dating industry, the relationship advice industry, the entire economy built around people's romantic insecurities. Real leaders aren't made in boardrooms. They're forged in solitude. Because leadership isn't about controlling others. It's about mastering yourself. It's about being so centered, so clear, so unshakable that others naturally want to follow. The man who loves solitude has spent years developing the most important leadership quality, self-knowledge. He knows his strengths, his weaknesses, his motivations, his fears. And when someone knows themselves that deeply, they become incredibly effective at everything they do. Every major spiritual tradition has known this secret. The path to enlightenment runs through solitude. Buddha found it under a tree alone. Jesus found it in the desert alone. Muhammad found it in a cave alone. Not because they were unsocial, but because truth can only be found in silence. The man who loves solitude isn't necessarily religious. He's spiritually dangerous because he's found God or peace or truth or whatever you want to call it. And he didn't need an institution to get there. Here's something nobody talks about. Solitude changes your body. When you stop living in constant stress about what others think, your nervous system relaxes. When you stop flooding your system with the chaos of constant social interaction, your energy returns. You sleep better because you're not replaying social interactions in your head. You eat better because you're listening to your body instead of eating socially. You move better because you're connected to yourself. He's not just mentally thriving, he's physically optimized. Here's what this all comes down to. The man who loves being alone has figured out the biggest secret in human psychology. You don't need anyone else's permission to be happy. You don't need their approval to live your life. You don't need their understanding to make choices that feel right to you. You don't need their validation to know your worth. And once you truly understand that, everything changes. Not because your external circumstances necessarily change, but because your relationship with those circumstances transforms completely. You stop being a victim of your environment and become the architect of your experience. The man who loves being alone isn't just thriving, he's free. And once you taste that freedom, once you experience that peace, once you feel that power, you realize that everything you've been taught about happiness, success, and fulfillment has been backwards. The answer isn't out there. It's in here. And the journey to find it begins the moment you stop running from yourself and start running toward who you're meant to be. If this opened your eyes to something you've been feeling but couldn't put into words, you know what to do. The man who loves being alone isn't just surviving, he's showing us all what it means to be truly alive. And that might be exactly what the world needs right now.